India is entering her 75th year as an independent nation. In 1947, the life expectancy of the average Indian was 31 years. That's right, just 31 years. Today, life expectancy is 69 years. India's GDP in 1947 was under 3 lakh crore rupees. Today, it's close to 3 trillion. We have come a long way as an independent nation. And as we enter a landmark year, there is significant room for improvement. And while we can take heart from the fact that we've more than doubled life expectancies to 69 years, even now, India is ranked 125 in the world, and the global average is nearly 73. There is no doubting that India is now a force to reckon with when it comes to the global economy, but still, India accounts for about 4% of the global GDP. In a bid to acquire economic strength, technological vitality, and moral leadership, by the time India celebrates its 75th year of independence, industry body CII has launched the India at 75 initiative. It was launched way back in 2007 when we mark 60 years of independence. And as we celebrate the 75th Independence Day, we take stock of the progress so far and the challenges that remain. Joining me now to discuss all of this and more is the President of CII and the Head of Tata Steel, TV Narendran, the President-designate of CII and the Head of Bajaj Finserv, Sanjeev Bajaj, and Rajan Navani, who heads the India at 75 Council at CII. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the program. TV Narendran, let me start by asking you, as I said, there is a lot to celebrate, there is a lot to look back at and learn from the past experiences as we defend the past as well as go forward to attack the future. So let me ask you about what, to your mind, have been the most game-changing ideas so far that have changed the direction and the course of the Indian economy and the Indian nation.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you for having us on the show. To me, the most significant change has been the opening up of the economy, because that's really helped us unleash the entrepreneurial spirits that's there in India. And I think we've seen a lot of development over the last 30 years, which we've recently celebrated. So I think that journey continues. Of course, there's a lot more to do, but I think that's really opened up India to a lot more of the potential that resides in India. And I think that's been, to me, one of the most important things going forward. The second thing I think which we've done well, we could do much better, is of course to make sure that education is there. I think we've done better in the higher end of the education than in primary education, but at least a lot of the technical talent that India provides to the world has happened because of the education that we have in place, but a lot more needs to be done there. So these are two areas where I think we've done reasonably well, but a lot more needs to be done.
Yes, and of course, as you point out, we're also celebrating the 30th anniversary of liberalization in India. Sanjeev Bajaj, let me put that point across to you. That coincides with the 75th Independence Day. And as TV Narendran was pointing out, a lot has changed. Many path-breaking reforms, many transformative reforms have been undertaken. As you look ahead, what do you believe we need to take cognizance of? What are the challenges that remain? What are the unaddressed areas in terms of pending reforms that we need to focus on?
So, Shireen, that's very clearly a broad question. Let me try and answer this at a few levels. We've seen over the last 3 decades of liberalization, all kinds of opening up, greater competition. We have companies that are competitive not only in India, but at a global level now. And I'm not going to delve further into that, but that's clear to all of us. There has been some significant change also that's happened in the last decade and a half, which is the way the government has adopted digitization and the entire digital protocols that have been set, along with, the trinity of JAM that they talk about, Jandan accounts, Aadhaar for KYC, and mobile phones, the entire network, cost and bandwidth, is enabling a country as large as ours to get digitized at levels which nobody could believe. See what's happened in the last year and a half with the pandemic. We are all using digital tools, from ordering groceries to our food in the evening, just so easily. This sets the infrastructure for significant amount of, I think, future growth as we move forward. So I would say the entire digital focus of this country has been one significant move. The second is the initial set of reforms that we've seen in financial services. Again, in the last 30 years now, we have a very strong banking network, an insurance network, and investment that SEBI runs. And digitization is helping us take this far and wide. There's again a lot more to be done, and maybe we'll come to that. But to me, this is very important as well. Third is that if we have to take this forward, we have great number of initiatives even now between the government and the private sector we are dealing with. You need more participative development, which means you need greater participation, whether it's at the government and the opposition level, whether it's the regulator and industry, or it's as business and community. This together will take us to that next level.
But Rajan Navani, as someone who's been overseeing the many initiatives undertaken under the India at 75 program at CII, this was, of course, started in 2007. What's the distance that's been covered realistically? What are the tangible differences, the tangible changes that you believe the program has been able to make?
Thanks, Shireen, and thanks for having us here. Let me just mention to you that, this journey has definitely been a long one, as you rightly said. And I think when CII embarked on it, it was very clearly a marathon, which would be run in, 400-meter sprints, and we have now come to, of course, the last sprint. But I must say that the early adoption, or the focus and accelerated push towards skill development that started out in 2007, with the formation of the Skills Development Council and, many other initiatives that corporate India took on, to kind of create an accelerated movement around skilling people so that there could be enhanced livelihood and mobilization of livelihood, as that one moved forward. We also found, other stakeholders, whether it's civil society and many others coming together. So if we look at the tangible change on the ground in terms of human capacity development, of people in India and their ability thereof to be able to, derive tangible livelihoods, I think there's been a huge jump, particularly when you look at technology and, so many, middle-class Indians today are able to, see such a big jump. I think people moving out of poverty, while, that has always been, a big one for a country which is, which has such large disparities, in a country like India, has definitely been, significant change from where, it was at that point. And we always talked about, the growth and the potential of, Indian industry really not only strengthening itself in India, but also, integrating globally and kind of creating a larger presence, at the world stage. I think that process also, has been enhanced. So when we look at it, across the board, right, I think the movement of India from an emerging country towards a developed nation and the steps thereof, have definitely been very visible changes that are there.
But on the issue of skills development, on the issue of employment, I mean, this is a young country. We have tom-tommed about the demographic dividend, the demographic advantage that we enjoy. But if we take a look at what the data is telling us, employment to population ratio as of December 2020 at 46.7%, skilled labor force at 21.2%. You have this whole digitization transformation taking place, as Sanjeev was pointing out. But there is a lack of employable talent given the kind of skills that are required. So how do you believe this as a challenge, as an issue, is something that needs to be addressed both by industry as well as government?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the unfinished agendas, employment and employability, right? So when you look at employability itself, I think we've obsessed far more on education than on vocational training, and I think there needs to be a better balance of that. Most developed countries across the world have greater respect for vocational jobs than we do. So there is a social issue. There is a issue about willing to pay higher for skills, because as manufacturing, as industry, when we hire for skills, we need to, pay higher for people who have gone through a vocational program, because when you hire an engineer, you pay more if they are from a good engineering college. When you're hiring a welder or somebody else, you don't really even check if that person has done some training which is relevant, So I think there's a mindset issue. Industry also needs to be willing to pay more for skills. As somebody once told me, the only professions where you pay higher for skills and for education are entertainment and sports.
But the premise of labor reforms, one would imagine, is to make it easier for business to do business, not easier for business to actually be able to let go of labor. And these two issues often get confused. At this point in time, as we're making the changes, as we're trying to attract capital, industry requires flexibility, but the lack of a safety net, the lack of a security net is also a real problem that needs to be addressed by industry as well as by government as we move ahead.
Absolutely. I think that's very true. And obviously, industry needs to play a role. I think part of the reason why a lot of the workforce is still informal or is because of the rigidity of some of the laws. So the flexibility which industry seeks sometimes is not there, and hence you have the informality of the workforce. So I think the central government, through some of the moves recently, has tried to simplify it. Now we need to get it implemented at the states so that you have more flexibility. Industry, I think, seeks more flexibility because many businesses have cyclicality that it needs to deal with, and so that flexibility allows that thing to be done. The second point that you said is also linked to health, the point that Rajan made, because a lot of people move, spend a generation coming out of poverty and then go back to poverty because of a bad health situation, right? And we've seen that in the last 18 months. So that's where the social security, and I think at the minimum, we need to see how can we provide better healthcare to the people who can't afford to pay for it, right? I think that is, to me, one of the minimum requirements. Industry needs to play a role there in whatever it can do. And I think a lot of our members in PI are doing that. But I think industry cannot solve the problem. The governments have far more resources and far more reach. And industry can work with government, cannot substitute for government in some of these. So I think we need to provide that cushion for those one-off situations where people slip back, And then, of course, if you can have social security for all, that's ideal. But even there could be intermediate steps in between.
Sanjeev Bajaj, I want to link back the point that you made on the transformation courtesy, digitization, the digital infrastructure that we've been able to put in place, the decline in rates as far as data and broadband are concerned, and link that to the new economy companies that we are now starting to see emerge. It's not just legacy businesses like yours, but there's a flurry of entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs who've taken the startup route and are now listing companies like Zomato, Paytm, Policy Bazaar, and so on and so forth. As we look ahead, how transformative do you believe this is going to be, not just from an economic perspective, but also from a financial inclusion and a wealth creation perspective?
Shireen, let's look at this in 3 or 4 different parts. What we've managed to achieve as a country is, one, as I talked about, we've created the digital norms. I'm going to say that just simply, the digital norms for digital trade to happen. Second, with our economy growing, okay, it's grown in spurts, but it's growing significantly over the past 2 decades, coming to almost $2,000 per capita. And we know in bigger cities, it is much more than that. There's money in the pockets, and there is this whole consumption economy that exists. Third is our entrepreneurial culture. From shopkeepers and small businesses, we are now a startup nation as much. And fourth is the opening up of alternate sources of capital over the last 15, 20 years. Prior to private equity, venture capital coming in, you could only take money from a bank. So this has opened up. Combination of this creates tremendous tailwinds for us to see not only startups, but you will see a reinvention of traditional businesses as well. And if there's one thing that's holding back, let me see in my own sector, let's look at insurance and banking. You've got all the new digital norms in place. You've got the fintech, insurtech players. They're showing us what they can do. Unfortunately, the older players are still hobbled by older norms. And that's where we need the more participative set of discussions to happen with the central bank, to happen with the insurance regulator, with SEBI, to see how do you reorient yourself for the future. And let me give you one simple little example. RBI announced last week that individuals can now directly buy bonds from the RBI. With RBI working on a digital currency, if in X number of years, we can directly trade in our own digital currency with RBI. It means with the digital currency, you no longer need a physical account with a local bank branch. RBI can open 1.3 billion digital accounts. Is there a role for traditional banks? I think this requires significant amount of discussion, disintermediation, like what we have seen the Amazons and the Flipkarts and the Nykas of the world do, is going to come to financial services as well. And the more it comes, the greater competition you create, more innovation you see, that is what would result in financial inclusion. And that's what we need to focus on.
Rajan, you talked about the reprioritization in the concluding year. Let me ask you that in the context of where you believe we have faltered, where you believe we haven't been able to do as much as what was expected, and what the course correction should look like, could look like.
So, when I said reprioritization, Shireen, what I meant really is there is certain need which is, very, very relevant today, right? I mean, today the role private sector can play in linking up with public, healthcare and infrastructure and really strengthening that, significantly as we move forward is probably the biggest opportunity and probably the biggest need for us, and therein lies probably what you said, has been the place where we've not made enough progress, right? I think, our challenges on healthcare and the system got very, very extensively visible, when the recent wave hit, right? And I think, while we were able to, overcome this crisis, I think it's important for us to invest further into it, to take this entire space holistically, look at, new ways in which, this entire piece can be addressed, and a lot to be done, right? So I think, making sure
but Rajan, give me specifics. Specifics. And I know that we've discussed this several times over through the course of the pandemic. And yes, the healthcare infrastructure deficit continues to exist. It's a glaring gap. But what is the role that the private sector will play there? Is it likely to be in the realm of corporate social responsibility or anything more than that? Because even if you look at what's happened as far as the vaccine plan was concerned, the private sector started by saying that, look, we will inoculate everybody and so on and so forth. A 25% private sector quota was then put in place by the government. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing now is that, there is adequate supply with the private sector, but not enough takers because of the price issue. So when you talk about partnering with the government, when you talk about the private sector playing a role in healthcare, for instance, or any of the social sectors, I mean, these will, I would imagine, be for-profit business models. Are you talking purely in the realm of corporate social responsibility?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a combination of both, Shireen. I think in the realm of corporate social responsibility, and particularly CII, has taken CII vaccination as a massive project. I don't know if you read, but, just 2 or 3 days back, CII, with Serum Institute, announced a large effort to mobilize, private sector to work, with hospital providers, with state governments, with locations of different areas to see how we can accelerate the entire vaccination process. So I think, the CSR piece from corporate India is definitely going to be something that's, going to extend, vaccination beyond employees, families of employees, into communities and others. I think it's a process that is ongoing, and, CI is, of course, at the forefront of it, and one very strong prioritized agenda for us to try and achieve in the coming year for sure. Right. In addition to what you said, the ability, therefore, even through for-profit enterprises, right, to be able to create, world-class healthcare infrastructure in India. Even if we look at strengthening, I don't know how well, private-public partnerships can be explored in these spaces. We can create, there is going to be, I think, a lot of thinking jointly with government and industry and business. And I think if I were to think of one theme, that 75th year of Indian independence should bring together, is business and government and civil society working with much deeper levels of trust towards a common cause, working together to make this happen. I don't think it is an isolated problem that either private industry or government, can try and solve, independently. Sure. And I think that, to me, would be a very core theme that CI is going to also probably take forward as we move forward.
But I want to address one of the other issues that each one of you spoke of. And TV Narendra, let me get you to address that. While we want to focus on the domestic market, we want to build out the vision and the story of Atmanirbharta, the fact of the matter is that we're also keen to use India as a marketplace that exports to the world, that is much more globally integrated. But that still is a long distance away, even if you look at our regional peers. I mean, exports to GDP as a percentage under 19% for India, Vietnam at over 100%, China, and other countries are far higher. What do you believe needs to be done to ensure that while we focus on domestic capacities and domestic capabilities, we also become much more globally integrated?
Yeah. Shireen, I think this is a very challenging subject, right? I mean, there are multiple views, even within the industry on the subject. I think the key point is how do we leverage the fact that India need not just be a source of global value chains, it is also a destination for global value chains, right? Many other countries don't have that privilege, right? Many of the countries you talked about are great sources, but not necessarily great markets. So we need to find that balance on how do we leverage both. How can you leverage India as a market to attract investments? While at the same time, how can you leverage India as a source to do more exports? And so finding that balance, because we need to create jobs, right? It's not just about making sure that everything is available cheap in the country, but you need people to have employment so that they have the income to buy whatever is available, right? And we are talking of large numbers of people who are looking for jobs, as we've just discussed. So I think that's a balance. And the Atmanirbhar effort is more to say, how can we get investments into India? How can we use the Indian market to scale up, build competitiveness and export? And I think one great example is the auto industry and the auto component industry in India, which has been developed over the last 30 years. And one of the biggest successes in manufacturing, right? We didn't have a world-class auto industry 30 years back. Today we have one. And almost anyone in the auto industry in the world is here. So to me, that is a balance that we need to find. It's not that one size fits all. Every industry needs to find the solution. Some industries are naturally advantaged in India because of, let's say, if you look at the minerals-based industries, India has a lot of minerals, so you can value add on that. Similarly, textile, etc. So I think we need to pick the industries where we can be global players and then support them to build scale in India and export to the world.
Gentlemen, since this is the vision board, leave me with one word or image that you would put on your vision board that really captures the essence of India at 75. Rajan, I'm going to start by asking you.
Inclusive development.
Okay, that's 2 words. TV Narendran, on the vision board, an image or a word that captures the essence, both the past and the future.
Resilient.
Resilient. Sanjeev Bajaj.
Take off.
Well, gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us here as we celebrate 75 years of India. Here's hoping that we continue to build on the opportunities and address some of the challenges that we have spoken of here today. Appreciate your time. Thanks very much for joining us. We will take a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere. But back in a moment. Stay with CNBC TV.